Hey guys, and welcome to another very exciting tutorial. In the world of image editing software, Adobe Photoshop is an absolute staple. In fact, it has become such a standard that the word Photoshop has been absorbed into the English language to refer to a photo that has been digitally altered. Not only does Photoshop offer a large number of artistic tools such as brushes, shapes, effects and gradients to create your own masterpiece from scratch, like this demented cat that I drew for you, but, and this is where its real power lies, it allows you to take any image or photograph and essentially change anything that you want about it. You can use it to remove or add visual elements at will, change all of the colors or retouch portrait photographs to erase wrinkles, reshape and youthify to the point of there being no facial features left. But that's getting a little bit creepy. In this tutorial, I simply want to take you through the absolute basics of how to use Adobe Photoshop and show you some of the really cool stuff that you can do with this powerful piece of software. But now, before I talk your face off, let's jump right into the tutorial. Welcome to my desktop, and because I don't want you to start off bored, let's just fire up Photoshop and jump right into it. Now, depending on which version of Photoshop you are using, your startup screen might look vastly different, but don't worry, all of the stuff I'm going to show you in this tutorial, you should be able to follow along with any version of Photoshop, whether that be CS2 or the latest CC 2018 that I have here. So let's just ignore this startup screen, simply come up to File, and let's select New. And again, this screen might look entirely different on your version of Photoshop, but don't freak out. We're just setting up a new file, and the main thing we need to define is the width and the height. And I've got that set to 1920 by 1080, which is full HD, but you can set that to whatever you want to. And then just find the OK or the Create button, and let's simply hit that. Here we are in our brand new project in Adobe Photoshop, and again all of the interface elements might look quite different depending on your version, and I'm going to stop saying that. Just assume that your edition of Photoshop might look quite different, but everything I'm going to show you, you should be able to follow along no matter which version you have. Now, the first thing you may notice if you haven't used Photoshop before is that the interface is quite full on. There's a lot of things going on around your actual working space. So let's break this down and look at these things one by one. At the very top, you will find the main menu, and in here you'll find your usual file operations for opening and saving your files or quitting Photoshop, edit operations to modify your layers and the elements on your canvas, image adjustments, different layers, types, selection modes, filters. You can work with 3D in Photoshop in case you didn't know, but we're not going to go into that in this video. You can change your view, zoom in and out, show rulers or grids and guidelines and all sorts of other fancy stuff. In the window menu, you can define what elements are visible on your interface, and if I ever cover something in this tutorial that you can't actually see on your screen, make sure you come into this window menu and make sure that's enabled, like your layer controls or your properties or your swatches. And over on the right hand side, you can jump into the Photoshop help, but hopefully after this tutorial you won't be needing that too much, but just see how you go. Directly underneath the main menu, you will find your tool options, and these options will change depending on what tool you have selected. And leading right into that, down on the left hand side you should find a palette with all of the tools that you have available in Adobe Photoshop. As you select these, you'll notice that your tool options change because each of these tools works very differently and has different options. So on the left hand side you have all of the things that let you do things to your layers and the images that you're currently working on. And then over on the right hand side, you will find the layers panel, and this is where you will probably spend a whole lot of time modifying, editing, merging and applying effects to your different layers. But again, we're going to cover that in a minute. Just know that layers are extremely important because the whole concept of Photoshop is that rather than just working with one layer, like you did in MS Paint or some of the other more basic programs, is that Photoshop is layer based. So you can have lots of different layers of different visual elements, stack them on top of each other and then blend them all together and make it look really nice and fancy. Because I know that earlier versions of Photoshop didn't actually show some of these panels, I'm actually going to right click some of them and simply close them out just so that the layers panel is a little bit bigger and it's a bit easier to see in this tutorial. I'm also going to click on this edge here between my working window and the panel on the right, and just kind of drag this over to the left just to make the layers panel a little bit bigger. Then at the bottom of the interface, and again this is a new addition, you will see the timeline because you can actually now work with video in Photoshop, but we're not going to touch on that at all, so I'm going to right click it and close this panel out as well. And as I said, if you're ever missing a panel, simply come up into your window and I could just re-enable the timeline in here or any of the other panels that you may have accidentally or deliberately closed. And finally, right in the center of Photoshop, you will find your main working area. This is where you can obviously see your work in progress, where you can see all of the layers and you can zoom in and out by holding down Alt on your keyboard or Option if you're on a Mac and scrolling on the mouse wheel. You can also press Ctrl and 0 to zoom to fit. And if Ctrl 0 or Command 0 on a Mac doesn't work for you, you can always come up into the main menu bar and under Edit, go all the way to the bottom, you'll find your keyboard shortcuts. And in this menu, you can customize any and all keyboard shortcuts for Photoshop. And I highly encourage you that if you don't know the keyboard shortcuts, go in here, look them up, customize this to your liking. Working with shortcuts is a whole lot quicker than trying to do everything via the menus. But again, I'm going to share some of my favorite keyboard shortcuts with you throughout this tutorial. So let's just cancel out of this and let's actually start creating something. As I've already mentioned, one of the basic principles of Adobe Photoshop is that you will be working with layers. By default, whenever you create a new file in Adobe Photoshop, in your Layers tab, you will find a single layer called Background. You can obviously paint on this, and in order to paint on this, let's come over all the way to the left-hand side to this toolbar here, and there's lots of options of different shapes and gradients and other things you can do. But let's just select this little paintbrush here, and if you look really closely, you may see that there's like a little triangle in the bottom right corner of some of these tools. What that means is you can click and hold, and you'll get a whole bunch of different options that are all kind of related to brushes. So this one is a brush, pencil, color replacement, or a mixer brush, and quite a lot of them, actually all of them, have this little triangular icon, so I can click and hold to get some more options. But what I'm going to do, I'm just going to select this brush tool here, come over into the middle of my canvas, and now I can simply click and drag to paint my current color. The color that I'm going to paint is my current foreground color, and that is defined down here in the bottom left in the tool panel. You'll see these two color swatches. Black right now is in front of the white tab, meaning black is my current foreground color and white is my current background color. I can press this little switch icon here to swap my foreground and my background color, or I can simply press X on my keyboard to swap them around. And left clicking in my canvas with a paint tool or a shape tool or anything that creates something will use the current foreground color. The reason to have a background color is for gradients or other effects that actually use two or more colors. They'll actually usually use the background color as well. But just know that in here, you can control your foreground and your background color. And in order to change the current foreground color, you can either double click this color patch here, and then let's change this over to, maybe we'll go a nice warm and orange, hit OK. And now your foreground color has changed. And now if you click and drag, I'm going to paint yellow. You can also obviously click on this swatches tab here, and maybe let's select a little bit of a blue. Let's paint a bit of blue here. And you can tell it's already turning into a massive masterpiece. But now you may not be happy with the size of your brush or the fact that it is quite blurred. And let me just change the color to a really bright pink so it stands out nicely. I can hold down Alt or Option on my keyboard, right click, and then I can drag left or right to change the size of my brush. And I can scrub up and down to change the hardness or the amount of feathering you get on the edge. So I can actually tighten this up, make the hardness 100%, and I can bring this in. And now I've got a really small, very harsh edged brush. I can also very easily make this bigger again and soften this out. And again, this is a really nice way to change the brush size as well as the hardness. It comes in really, really handy. But now, one thing we've done, we've painted all of this on a single layer, so I can't actually easily get rid of any of this. I can't re-reveal the elements underneath it unless I simply undo everything. And speaking of undo, if you press Ctrl and Z to undo in Photoshop, you'll obviously undo your last brush stroke. But, and I don't know whether this is just the latest version, if you press Ctrl and Z again, you're going to undo your undo. You're essentially doing a redo. So if you go Ctrl Z, Ctrl Z, Ctrl Z, Ctrl Z, you're simply toggling back and forth. And that has to do with the way Photoshop keeps every single command you ever execute in your history. So undo simply undoes the last command, even if that just was another undo. If you want to keep undoing and going back in history, you need to hold down Ctrl, Alt, or Command and Option and press Z. Press Z, press Z, and this will actually go back in history. To redo, you can hold down Ctrl and Shift or Command and Shift and press Z, and that's going to reapply all of your actions. And if you want to get a little bit more control about going back and forth in time, you can actually bring up the history. And again, you may want to reveal that from the window. There's a history right in there, and that's going to reveal your history. And that actually has my entire history of everything I've done. And I can click anywhere back in history, and that's going to take me back to that point in time. I can reapply any part of my masterpiece. Let's just go back to the very end. Let's collapse the history again. So you have full control about going back and forth, and you can configure how many actions are being saved, so how big your history can be. But now I've been wanting to talk about layers, but we haven't actually yet created another layer. So let's come into the layer panel, go down all the way to the bottom, and over on the right hand side, right on the left side of this little trash bin here, you've got this little icon of a paper. And if you click that, that will create a new layer. Notice that layer 1 is currently selected. I can also click on the background, and that is going to reselect my background layer. Now, anything I paint with my brush, so let's select maybe a green, let's paint that here on the right hand side, is going to be applied to the layer that I actually have selected. So this has been applied to my background layer. Let's undo that with Ctrl Z. Let's select layer 1, and let's drag and paint green right over the center. And now this brush stroke has actually been applied to layer 1. I can click this little eye icon here to toggle this layer on and off. And you can see these two pieces are actually totally separate. They're separate layers. And in Photoshop, it's not uncommon to have 50 layers. You may have a huge amount of different layers that are all blended together. You may decide to start your masterpiece painting out, just the background images. And then you may paint foreground elements on separate layers and kind of just merge them all together in the end. And it gives you a huge amount of flexibility to move all of these layers around, transform them, change them, and do all sorts of cool stuff, because all of the visual elements are still nice and separate. They just look like they all belong together in your final result. Now, if you don't like your layer names, or like me, you're a little bit of a neat freak, you can double click onto the layer name and you just simply rename them. Let's call this one green stroke, because I'm very imaginative that way. Let's come down, let's create a new layer. Let's select a red color, and let's create a color gradient. For that, over on the left hand side, you should find the gradient tool, and by default, you may actually just see a paint bucket here. So the gradient tool sits under the paint bucket, so simply click and hold on this paint bucket, select the gradient tool, and notice how in the tool options, this now shows me all of the options available for creating gradients. Over on the left hand side, I can obviously see the actual gradient I'm about to create, and by default, that is my foreground color blending to the background color, so that's red to white. I can also click on this gradient, and that is going to bring up the gradient editor, and in here I can change my gradient, add all sorts of colors, or select some cool presets like this rainbow here, which I'm kind of liking, so let's simply hit OK. And in order to place down a gradient, you simply click and drag, and it's going to give you a little line, and the gradient is going to extend from the start to the end point of this line. So let's drag this all the way over to the right hand side. Let's let go. And Photoshop has added a really cool radial gradient into this layer. And note that this is now in this new layer here, and I can again toggle this off, turn this on. I can also click and drag this layer to rearrange it, and for example place this rainbow underneath my green stroke. So now my green stroke is on top. Let's also rename this by just double clicking onto this name. Let's call this one rainbow. Let's temporarily disable the visibility of our green stroke just by disabling this little eye icon here. And if you don't like the radial gradient in the tool options, let's just change this over on the left hand side to just a linear gradient. Let's click bottom left all the way to the top right hand side and let go. And now I've got a little nice linear rainbow gradient spanning all the way across my masterpiece. And if I feel that this is just a little bit too much color for me and I can't quite handle it, you can simply delete the rainbow layer by selecting it, coming down into the layer window and clicking this little trash bin here. That's just simply going to delete the rainbow layer. Photoshop CC 2018 is nice enough to ask me whether I'm sure I want to do that. Let's just say no, I'm not really. But you can also click and drag this rainbow layer, and rather than rearranging it, you can drag it and drop it on this trash bin down in the bottom right, and that's simply going to delete it and not ask you, because it assumed that, this is quite a deliberate action to drag it all the way down here onto the trash bin, and you probably wanted to do that. Let's press Ctrl Z one more time to undo that, and let's talk about blend modes. Now, by default, every layer from bottom to top is just applied just like normal pixels onto the layers below them. However, you can actually change the blend mode, the way these layers are merged with the layers below them. For example, my green stroke right now in the layers panel up here at the top is set to normal, and this is the blend mode of the layer. If you pop this open, you have a whole bunch of different options to blend this layer differently onto the layers beneath it. Let's, for example, change this to screen. And you can see I immediately got a totally different result. Let's change it to soft light. That's a bit hard to see. Let's change it to difference. So you can actually create some really cool effects simply by changing this blend mode here. And this just determines how this layer is going to be merged or blended with all of the layers beneath it. Over on the right hand side, you can also change the opacity, so you can kind of make it less or more visible. And the opacity just refers to how opaque the layer is. So opacity of 100 means the layer is fully visible. At 0 opacity, it's entirely invisible, so you can kind of fade it in and kind of tweak that to your liking. But this is obviously going to affect the entire layer. Let's hide this green stroke again. Let's come to our rainbow layer. And let's say I want a little bit of a hole in the middle of this rainbow layer to kind of show this background through. Now, the easiest way to do this is simply come into your toolbar, about middle down, select the erase tool, and again hold and select the erase tool if it's not immediately visible. Like any other tool, I can hold down Alt or Option on my keyboard, right click and change the size as well as the hardness of this brush. Let's just kind of cut a hole right into the middle of this rainbow layer. You can see the background showing through, and that's kind of cool. But now what I've done, I've actually deleted pixels. I've deleted image information from this rainbow layer. I literally cut a hole into this layer. And if at some later stage I feel like, oh, I actually want to have this back, I can't. I've destroyed parts of my layer. Fortunately, Photoshop has a really powerful way to control the opacity of a layer using something called layer masks. So let's undo all of this. And for that, let's just pop open the history. And let's just look at where did we start erasing. So let's just come to this fill opacity change. And we've undid our erase operation. Collapse the history again. And let's define the opacity on this layer to cut a hole into it a little bit more intelligently. In order to add a layer mask to your layer in the layers panel, and this is why I keep saying this is where you'll do a whole lot of work in Photoshop, make sure the layer is selected. Come down to the very bottom to this little white square with a black dot in the middle, and you can't see the pop-up tooltip. It actually says add layer mask. Let's click this button, and you can see in your layer panel we still have this rainbow layer, and we have this little white patch over on the right hand side. And as I click these, you can see I'm selecting the rainbow layer or I'm selecting the layer mask, and this is actually another layer, another image layer that sits on top of this rainbow. And this one is actually grayscale. And what happens is that whatever we paint onto this layer mask, which is invisible, is going to be applied as the opacity or the transparency onto this rainbow. And if that doesn't make any sense at all, let's make sure that the layer mask is currently selected. Come over to the toolbar. Down in the bottom, by creating this layer mask, your foreground color should already be set to black, but let's make sure that this is set to black. Press X to swap them if you want to get that a little bit quicker. Let's select the brush tool. Make sure that the layer mask is selected, so it's got this little highlight here, otherwise you're going to paint onto this rainbow layer. So the layer mask is selected. Come into our workspace. Let's just make this a little bit bigger, and I'm going to make this a bit softer as well. And let's simply click and drag to draw. And you can see I'm essentially, again, cutting a hole into this rainbow layer. However, if you now look over on the right hand side, my rainbow layer, I hope you can see that, is actually undisturbed, but this layer mask has this little black dot in the middle. Feels like it's doing the same thing, but the power of layer masks is that now what you can do is I can actually change this layer mask to bring the opacity of this layer back. So I can swap my background and my foreground with X, bring white to the foreground color of my current brush with the layer mask selected. Let's click and paint. And I'm essentially painting this layer back because I'm now adding that white back into the layer mask. So I'm again just defining the opacity of my rainbow layer with this layer mask. And this is really, really powerful because it allows you at any point in time to essentially erase parts of your layer. But then later on, if you change your mind or something didn't quite work, you just bring it back. You just repaint this layer mask to bring any part of the layer back that you want. Now, if you ever reach a point where you're really happy with how this layer mask works and you just want to bake it into the layer, or maybe want to disable it or delete it, simply come into your layers window, right click onto this layer mask, and now you can either disable it, you can also just re-enable it, right click, you can delete it, you can apply it, which will actually apply this mask and kind of stencil that out of your layer, but let's do Ctrl Z to undo that. You can right click, you can also add it to the selection, you can do all sorts of other weird things, but for now I think I'm just going to delete it because I feel I've covered layer masks good enough for, just getting you started using them. So let's just delete this layer mask and let's talk about smart objects. One of the really powerful features of Adobe Photoshop, and this has actually been introduced in version CS2, is the ability to use smart objects. What I mean by that is that usually images are pixels, right? But the problem with that is that if you ever shrink your image and then try to scale it back up, you've lost a lot of that information and everything becomes really pixelated. To show you what I mean, let's select the rainbow layer, press Ctrl or Command and A to select everything, and then press Ctrl or Command and T for transform. So we now essentially have this whole rainbow layer selected and we can transform it. You can actually click and drag these corners to now rescale and reshape your layer. You can also hold down Shift, so the scaling will happen uniformly, so you're not going to lose the aspect ratio or distort your layer unduly. But let's just shrink this down to quite small. Let's let go. Press Enter to apply this transformation. Note that the layer is still selected. Let me just press V to return to my selection tool so you can actually see the cursor. Note that the layer is still selected. Let's press Ctrl and T again to again transform this layer. Click on a corner, hold down Shift so we scale it up uniformly. And let's just bring it back to its original size. And you'll see that, wow, it's gotten really pixelated. And that is because by scaling it down and up, we've lost a lot of that detail. We've lost a lot of the resolution. And you've just destroyed most of your image. Unless this is the look you're going for, in which case, well done. Let's cancel this transform operation by pressing Escape. Hold down Ctrl and Alt or Command and Option and press Z to undo our original scaling of the layer. So we're back to where we started. And now let's convert this layer to a smart object. For that, in your Layers window, simply right click on the layer and select this option to convert to smart object. You'll see this little mechanical square, I'm not quite sure what this is, this little icon being indicated on this layer telling me that this is a smart object. Now, with the layer still selected, if you press Ctrl and T, nothing will actually happen because we haven't selected any pixels. We actually have converted this into a smart object, something that's wrapping up the actual image that sits inside it. So you actually need to press Ctrl or Command D first to unselect everything. And just with the layer selected, but no actual pixels selected, Ctrl and T for transform. And let's scale this down. Again, holding down Shift. Let's scale this really, really small. Press Enter to apply it. Let's press Ctrl and T again to rescale this layer. Let's bring all of this back up. And you'll note that this looks exactly the way it did. We didn't lose any pixel information because by converting it to a smart object, we told Photoshop to essentially wrap this image in a container, and we're only resizing the container. All of the image information that sits inside the smart object is going to be maintained at any point in time, so you can do whatever you want without fear of losing the actual detail in that image. Now, there are some things you can't do with smart objects, like you can't select the eraser tool and just erase stuff from this object because it's not actually pixels, it's pixels wrapped in a container object. So there are some things you won't be able to do. If you do need to erase them or you want to convert this back to pixels, simply come back into your layers window, right click onto your smart object and select this option to rasterize the layer, and that will render the layer out and convert it back to pixels. So now this layer is turned back into pixels, the little icon for the smart object is gone, and again I can click and drag to erase any parts of my layer that I want. Again, let's undo that because I actually do quite like this rainbow, and let's use Photoshop for what most people seem to be using it, and that is modifying an existing image. The easiest way to import images into Photoshop is simply to pop open an Explorer window or a Finder window if you're on the Mac, navigate to where you have the image that you want to bring in, and simply drag and drop it into the Photoshop interface. And you can either drop it in an existing project like this Untitled one, which we have created, or you can drop it next to it, in which case it will import it as a separate file. Let's just drop it next to this Untitled one image for now. And that's going to open it up in a separate tab. So this is a new image that we could modify. But let's just jump back to this Untitled one, which is our original image. Let me bring up my Explorer window again. Let's just grab this and drag and drop this right onto our canvas. And this is going to bring the image in. Let's just scale this down a little bit. Again, I'm holding down Shift so I can scale this uniformly. Let's position this right in the center. Press Enter and this gets applied. And do note that this comes in as a smart object, so I could scale this down if I wanted to. I haven't actually lost anything yet. Obviously, if I select the brush tool and wanted to paint on this image, I'd obviously have to rasterize it first. So let's say we're happy with where it's positioned. Come into the layer window, right click our imported image and just say rasterize the layer, and now we can paint on it. But let me undo that with Ctrl and Z, and let's look at how to apply layer styles. Now, layer styles allow you to easily apply all sorts of cool looking effects to your layers in your current project. For that, make sure that the layer you want to modify is selected. So I'm going to select this Tasmania Bay of Fires layer right here. Come down to the bottom and press this little FX icon. And here I can now apply a bevel and an emboss, stroke, inner glows, satins, outer glows, all sorts of cool effects. Or if I'm not quite sure just yet, I can simply come to blending options, which will pop open a menu that gives me access to all of these. So right here, you can see all of these different options and you can simply enable them. So I could say I want a bevel and an emboss. It's kind of hard to see, it's just along the edge, but maybe I want a little bit of a satin look, so it's kind of got a little bit of that gradient going, but maybe I just go bevel and emboss, maybe just add some texture because that should be quite easy to see. So now kind of got this really nice textured overlay. If you select the texture tab, in here you can change, for example, the pattern. You can have a little bit more of a really ruggedy pattern or more paperish styles, so you can kind of tweak this in any way you want. There's lots of options in here. I'm not going to go through them. You can adjust the scale and how strong this effect is. And there's lots and lots of different effects and layer styles. Maybe we'll apply a little bit of a gradient overlay here. And again, this is kind of like a little color gradient. And anywhere we see a gradient in Photoshop, actually bring this in a little bit. Seems a bit odd. You can click on that and then select whatever gradient you want. I'm going to put this sunset colored one. And the blend mode of this is currently set to darker color. Maybe I'll just change this over to screen. So now I'm getting this really interesting looking orangey glow over it. I can lower the opacity, just have a little bit, maybe bring the scale down a bit. And so there's all these different effects and things that you can apply directly to your layer in Adobe Photoshop. Maybe I'll also give this a drop shadow and let's just simply hit OK. And now if you look in your layers window, underneath the layer, you can see there's this little effects icon here. And under that, you've got the bevel and emboss, which we've added, the gradient overlay, and the drop shadow. You can click on any of these eye icons to enable or disable any of these effects. And if you want to modify them, you can actually simply double click any of these effects. So I can click on gradient overlay. That's going to bring up the options and pre-select me gradient overlay. So I can tweak this right in here. Let's cancel out of that. If I'm on a different layer, like this rainbow here, and I want to apply some layer styles, obviously, I can come down to this little FX button here, but I can actually also just double click on the layer. Don't click on the name. If you double click the name, it's going to rename the name. But if I click over on the right hand side a little bit here, just double click. This is going to bring up the same layer styles menu where I've got all of these options in. Let's just cancel out of that. And not only can you show, unshow, or edit any of these effects directly from your layers window, you can actually drag them and apply them to different layers. So I can actually take these effects, click and drag. So the entire set of effects from this Tasmania Bay of Fires layer, just drop that onto the rainbow layer. So now all of these effects are applied to the rainbow layer instead. I can also take individual ones like this drop shadow, click and drag, and drop this onto the Tasmania Bay of Fires layer. And now Tasmania Bay of Fires only has this drop shadow, and the rainbow has everything else. You can also copy these layer styles between layers. And for that, simply hold down Alt or Option, click on any of these effects and drag them to the other layer. So I'm dragging this gradient overlay from the rainbow over to Tasmania Bay of Fires. Let go. And now I've got this gradient overlay on both the Tasmania Bay of Fires and my rainbow layer. So it's really easy to customize and add all sorts of layer styles and then obviously change and tweak these effects in any way that you want. And you can get some really nice results really quickly. Finally, this wouldn't be a complete Photoshop tutorial if I didn't at least show you how to apply filters to your layers. So let's solo this rainbow layer. Again, remember to hold down Alt or Option on your keyboard and click on this little icon, and we're going to solo the rainbow layer. Let's come up into the main menu, and in your filter options, you will find a whole bunch of different effects that you can apply directly to your layer. Obviously, I'm not going to go through all of these. Let's simply select Distort. Maybe we'll apply a ripple effect. That's going to bring up the ripple options, and it shows you a little bit of a preview here, and you can kind of scroll around in that, or zoom in and out just so you can see a little bit of what this effect is going to look like. Let's just bring up the amount by quite a bit. Let's just change the size from medium to large, and obviously all of these effects will have different options, so just play with them, tweak them in any way you want. Let's hit OK, and we now have this really cool filter applied to our rainbow layer. Now obviously there's a huge amount of different effects, but some of the more interesting ones actually allow you to paint them onto your layers. For that, let's just re-enable our image for the Tasmania Bay of Fires, make sure it's selected, let's come up into filter and let's select the liquefy effect. And it's got a dot, dot, dot there for a reason, because what this is going to do, it's going to bring up a brand new liquefy interface. And in here, I've got a huge amount of options. Again, I'm not going to go through all of them. Leave me comments down below if there are certain things you'd like me to cover again. I'm just going to hold down Alt, scroll on my mouse wheel to zoom in a little bit. And I can now change my brush size, maybe make this a little bit smaller. And I can now essentially click and paint liquefaction effects on my image layer, and this is how a lot of professional photos are being modified and edited slightly. Obviously, what I'm doing here is not in any way subtle, but you can use this in really, really nice, subtle ways to enhance your photos and do all sorts of cool things. There's a huge amount of tools here. I just kind of wanted to show you this concept of essentially painting effects onto your layers, which Photoshop does have quite a bit, and it's got some really powerful options for that. But again, just play around with this, have some fun. There's some exciting stuff you can do. Let's just hit OK. The effect is now going to be applied to my Tasmania Bay of Fires layer, and I've got this really trippy piece of art kind of image here. Once you're done with your masterpiece, you can obviously save it by pressing Ctrl and S or File and Save. However, this will save it in the Photoshop format, which is a PSD format. But you can very easily save this as a PNG, a TGA, or a JPEG image, or in any other format that you can then share with your friends. So let's just change this to artwork.jpg. Hit save, and because JPEGs are compressed, Photoshop is going to ask you for the options like whether you want a lot of quality or low quality but very small file size. And just hit OK, and it's going to export that onto your hard drive to whatever folder you have selected, and you're going to share it with your friends, your family, upload it to the internet, or just do whatever you want with it. But now I hope I covered enough of the basics to get you started and get you excited about using Photoshop. Obviously, there's a huge amount of tools on the left-hand side I haven't even touched on yet. There's a huge amount of options in all of these menus I haven't even covered yet. If there's anything in particular that you would like me to create a separate tutorial for, just leave me some comments down below. Let me know what you think. And I really hope that this gave you a good first look at all of the awesome stuff that you can do with Adobe Photoshop. And that's all there is to it. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe if you don't want to miss any of my upcoming videos. If you want to further support me in what I do here, maybe pick up some merchandise or get access to my private Discord server, be sure to check out my Patreon page. And as always, if you do have any comments, questions or suggestions, just leave them down in the section below. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I will see you later.